come here and talk to you about the relationship between science and religion. And he said I had about 40 minutes to do that. Thank you for inviting me to do the impossible. Because normally it takes me about 20 lectures, and each lecture lasts about 50 minutes. And my students have had access to online articles and journal articles and books and professional conferences. And you have had breakfast. So let's see what we can make of this, shall we? My title, I've chosen a title being also rather literary. Like, my title is A Plague on Both Your Houses. It doesn't refer to Christ and St. Luke. It comes from Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet, and there are these two warring families, the Montagues and the Capulets. They've been at each other's throats, feuding for so long, they hardly know why anymore. It's just such fun stabbing each other. And it's all fueled by ignorance and anger, in other words. Two houses, and some very attractive meat to the media, street fighting. Well, it's not an exact parallel to science and religion. I'll try and show you why it isn't. But it is the case that the extremes get all the press. And all the sort of boring, rational people in the middle who actually have a job to do, we never get any press at all. There are a lot of money goes into perpetuating this. It's called the conflict model of the relationship between science and religion. Anytime you have science and religion, you have conflict, but that's not true, and that's why I'm here. I know it's not true, I'm going to try and persuade you. It's actually worse than Shakespeare, because the two houses of science and religion speak the same language. They're like two tribes on either side of a river, a boundary of some kind, and it's mutual incomprehensibility, which makes this whole thing much worse. So I think a joke might help, just testing. A bartender says, "We don't serve faster than light neutrinos here." A neutrino walks into a bar. See, some of you didn't laugh, but when I told that to my colleagues in the physics department of William and Mary, there was tears running down their face. So simple is their sense of humor. But that's mathematics. We scientists, in a lot of our work, speak a different language. Language we think that describes this world best, that creation, is mathematical. There's a nifty little equation, F equals gmm prime over r squared, which I'm going to carve into the walls of your church. And it's Newton's law of universal gravitation. It's what's keeping you in your seats right now, apart from sheer tedium. And it's also keeping the Earth in orbit around the Sun. And because they don't speak much mathematics and religion, and you're religious, I'm not going to say more about mathematics, but I felt I had to at least acknowledge it. The ritual nod and obeisance to mathematics. Well, all of us have experience of religion, in our case, Episcopalian Christianity. And I know that one or two of you have a scientific background, but maybe it would help to have a translator who can speak the language on both sides. So I'll do that. People understand, don't they, that the Earth does go in orbit around the Sun. Galileo understood that. You think so. NASA thinks so. But not everybody on the frontier between science and religion on one side of it thinks so. A couple of years ago, a group of 4 or 5 men convened a conference in South Bend in Indiana to insist that Galileo was wrong and that the church was right, that the sun must go round the earth, and the earth must stand still at the very center of the universe. They believed this because the church could never get something like that wrong in interpreting the scripture, which also shows that they weren't Episcopalian. For them, all that science, all those centuries, it was a conspiracy, a cover-up. It doesn't matter to them that the Pope and the Catholic Church, which was where they came from, declared that Galileo was right a very long time ago. Never mind that. They couldn't have been wrong. So I suppose that some of you must have seen that movie Apollo 13. Just raise an eyebrow for 2 times and raise a hand. Apollo 13, I don't give me a hand up. And every adult needs Oops, we have to do that. Apollo 13, and Tom Hanks and the astronauts flying back to Earth when they have, as they say in Houston, we have a problem. If the Earth really was standing still in the middle of the universe, they wouldn't have a problem. Just fly straight back and land here. But the Earth moves, and it's a moving target, hence the problem. And that's why they had trouble getting home. Other Christians believe it's a matter of faith, and despite the overwhelming evidence of geology, physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, they, virtually all science, they believe that the Earth was created pretty much in its present form in 4004 BC. And you're thinking, that makes it created before Kerr was born. Well, there are reasons to suppose that may not be the case. But they actually reject modern science, and they're afraid of it. And they are constantly bringing cases to law. In Kansas, they just have to bar the teaching of evolutionary biology in class because it will turn their children into atheists. Well, it just doesn't work. It can be done. But I will also tell you this. A colleague of mine at William and Mary and I used to have to write letters of reference to medical schools. And we refused to write a letter of reference for anyone who didn't believe in evolution, because evolutionary change happens in every hospital, and it's just a feature of life. Not to believe in it makes a doctor a menace. So we would say, find somebody else to write your letter of reference, because we can't, in all honesty, say that you would be safe in a hospital. That's how serious it is. Oh well, not much we can do about it here, but you might want to know why they think that if you don't already. And it goes back to the century in which modern science really got going, and that's the 17th century, and in England. There's a very great Anglican scholar, Archbishop James Ussher, and he calculated the date of creation that these guys believe in. It had to be nightfall preceding the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. And other scholars, Cambridge man, Cambridge man, did even more fine-tuning. He calculated that human beings were created at 9 in the morning on the 29th of October, 4004 BC. We knew it was autumn because the apples were ripe in the Garden of Eden. Now, that makes everybody laugh, but you know, Isaac Newton, who's probably the greatest British scientist, also believed in it and did calculations of his own. Didn't get the right answer, but you know, he calculated and calculated. That was when science and religion overlapped, and sometimes people weren't clear which they were doing. I think it's quite a good idea to know when you're doing science and when you're doing theology, so that there's a whole slew of people here and spreading throughout the world who believe that you have to believe the world is created in 4004 BC and that dinosaurs played with human beings. Always strikes me as odd in a society that has flat-screen TVs and MRIs and CAT scans, laser eye surgery, anesthetics for dentistry and the Hubble telescope. I'm still not sure how you can get away thinking that it's your religious duty to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. The person who said that was in Alice in Wonderland, which tells me where these guys live. So that's one of the two houses that are of my title. People who believe that science is the enemy of religion, especially in Christianity, but it's also true in Judaism and Islam. And my Jewish scholars from Oxford and people from the Islamic Institute face the same sort of issue. People say the world must be this old and that God created trees with rings in them and light coming from space, just as if it looked, and put fossils in the rocks to tempt faithless scientists to make the world because of issue. If God had done that, that would have made the creation and the creator deception. We don't believe that God deceives. The idea that God would tuck fossils into rocks to have paleontologists drift into unbelief, what kind of God does that? Not the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the best reason for not accepting their view is theological, and all the other reasons. Way out on the other pole is what's called scientism. And that's scientific fundamentalism. the likes of the late Christopher Hitchens, who was a very funny man, Richard Dawkins, Peter Atkins. They're all great professional public atheists. The last two are very competent scientists, both very. And they insist that if you know any science, you have to be an atheist, like them. You simply can't be religious. And Richard Dawkins will tell you that religion's just a meme, which is an idea he made up for himself. And he'll tell you again and again that religion is just bad poetry. That's all it is. He says, based on an obsession with things representing other things they slightly resemble, or resemble in one respect. First of all, poetry speaks in metaphors and models, and so does all theology. But so does science. Science, when you're doing a theory, when you're doing new work, you model the unknown in terms of the known. So we take tiny little steps. We say, this is sort of like that. Let's test it. Let's find out how much it's like this. Dogs are not the same as cats, but they're similar. Let's find out the ways in which they're different. That's what science does. And all the facts are data to help support theories and hypotheses, and frankly, wild guesses sometimes. So whenever you hear critics say about science or any aspect of it, it's just a theory, please remember that science is its theories. It just is its theories. The facts and the data from the world, that's exactly what science does. It takes that data, tests the theories. And Hitchens, very articulate critic, last month died of cancer about a year and a bit ago. He just thought it was, well actually, this is what he said. And you compare it with what we experience here at Christ and St. Louis. Right? Here you go. Religion is the elevation and collectivization of credulity and solipsism, and the arrangement of these into institutional dogma, creed. It's the attempt to decide what shall be taught, what shall be allowed in the way of sexual conduct and speech and even thought, and what shall be legislated. And it's an attempt to make such decisions beyond challenge through the invocation of supernatural authority. That's true for some Christianity. But it's a perfect description of totalitarianism, and it fits much better the atheist regimes of Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao. It fits them perfectly. It doesn't at all fit Buddhism, if you think Buddhism is a religion. And no Episcopalian would recognize that as the Christianity in which we live and have our being. It's not done right. It doesn't tell you what to think or what kind of coffee to drink. This is such a distortion, isn't it?
Well, actually, I do tell them what kind of coffee. But
I wish I'd known that. I wouldn't have used that. Perhaps he doesn't tell you what sort of tea. So that's the other extreme. That's scientism. Those are the two poles, the Montagues and the Catholics. You've got on one side young earth creationist Christians, they're facts, they have loads of money. On the other side, you've got best-selling authors who are scientism advocates. The belief is that science can explain everything. If it hasn't done so yet, it soon will. My humble students at William & Mary, there are one or two, my humble students at William & Mary know that this is not a scientific claim they're making. It's not tested in a laboratory or by field observations. This is a dogma or a creed. And the unassailable authority it claims is science. It's just not true. So science claims that science is the only form of true knowledge, but not scientifically. All of these chucks are very narrowly educated. My friends who are philosophers use them for fun in their teaching, and they produce examples from their books and produce their students to help us laugh down. It's a great pity. None of them is a theologian at all. None is a philosopher, and they're very weak on history. So that's why I say I play on both their houses. So here's what's true and what's encouraging. American college professors in science, thousands of them, were surveyed back in 1906 about their religious views. It's a sort of Gallup poll. Thousands of them. And that was in 1906. And about 40% of them then said that they went to church regularly or to synagogue some may be to mosque. They pray regularly. Actually, no. A rather distinguished professor of anthropology at Northwestern, who was teaching there, he insists that he's an atheist, but he also says he wakes up every night to pray for his daughter. Well, I've met his daughter. I can see why. It's a funny kind of atheist, isn't it? Funny. And another 40% of this group say they're spiritual but not religious, which is again the flavor of the month. What they'd say is that they don't know whether there's a God or not. And there's only a tiny fraction, there's ever been a tiny fraction of all the professors of science which were surveyed. It's a very large number. Very tiny fraction said they actually knew there could be no God. Well, that was 1906, and the same questions were asked in 2006. Very same questions. Huge survey of people teaching science in American universities. Guess what? The percentages were unchanged. Now, the theory that Dawkins and Kerr had was that in a century where there was more and more science, and it was getting bigger and better, that religion should have just withered and flowed away. But it didn't. It remains unchanged. There are countries where there's not much formal observance of religion. There are countries where there's a lot. But if you ask people who teach science in universities, they will tell you, yes, I do believe, and I pray. There ain't not necessarily much for church doing. But that's not the question. The question is, do you believe in God? Do you pray? Yes and yes. 40% definitely yes. Another 30 or 40% saying, I believe so, and I pray, but I'm not absolutely sure, which is called agnosticism. So that's an interesting thing. Essentially, with all that science, the number of believers remains the same. So that proved that the Dawkins hypothesis, that you get more science, you get no religion, that's been shown to be false over a time scale of a century and over thousands of people. Well, I think I should tell you what it's like to be a research scientist, because I'm quite sure that you're not all research scientists. I'll tell you a true story, okay? And I'm going to tell you a story about two chaps who won the Nobel Prize in 1978, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. They were astrophysicists, and they were working at the Bell Labs in Crawford, New Jersey, where they have a gigantic antenna which they were using to measure microwave radiation out there in space. The antenna is shaped like a horn from the small end, where there's a receiver. It gets bigger and bigger, has an open end, which would be most of that wall, that big square open end. And then it's on tracks, and you can lift it up and you can turn it and point it all over the sky. And they were doing this. They were measuring cosmic background radiation. But they had a problem. Pigeons. The open end of the horn antenna was very attractive to local pigeons. And the pigeons flew in, that's the opening, they just flew in there, and they nested and they did all the messy things that pigeons do on their cars and elsewhere. And it was all over the inside of it. And every now and then they'd send a graduate student in to clean up the nest, which is why we have graduate students. There's lots of them myself, but no pigeons. And there are two versions of what happened next. Every time Penzias and Wilson switched on their antenna and pointed it at the sky, they found there was a noisy, small, persistent bit of interference, just a little running along the bottom of the screen. And after a while, they decided that this was being caused by pigeon droppings. And nobody has ever got the Nobel Prize for measuring the microwave radiation from pigeon poop. So they decided to get rid of the pigeons. But being St. Francis-like, initially they caught the pigeons, put them in little cages, loaded them into Bob Wilson's station wagon, and drove them way down to the other end of New Jersey, opened the boxes, and fly away, little feathered friends. Then they got back in the car and started riding back, but there'd been a fire and the traffic was solid on the turnpike, and they were stuck. And eventually they got back, but the pigeons had got there first. They must have been part homing pigeon. And then this story gets dark. Each physicist blames the other. I've only heard it from one side, but I can't vouch for that being the truth. Each physicist blames the other, but somehow the pigeons disappeared, never to be seen again. The next day, bright and early, Penzias and Wilson trotted down, turned on the antenna, lifted it up to point at the sky, and the faintness was still there. Exactly the same as it'd been everywhere, no matter where they pointed. If you pointed it directly at a star, you get a roar of noise because stars emit a great deal of energy. But if you pointed it at the sky between the stars, it's got the same little hiss, corresponding to a temperature of about 2.8 K, just above absolute zero. So completely by accident, they found exactly what the theoretical physicists at Princeton, Dickey, Peebles, and Wilkinson had predicted. They predicted that the last remnants of the Big Bang, now after 13.7 billion years of the universe ticking away, it should be exactly this value. These guys found that it was so, and also realized what it is that they'd found. So they didn't start looking for something else that was the matter with the instrument. They suddenly realized that they had struck gold, and they won the Nobel Prize for physics for this. Big Bang. They found evidence for the Big Bang consistent with everything else. Big Bang theory was originally a term of ridicule invented by another British atheist scientist, but actually it was predicted in the 1920s by, wait for it, by a Belgian theoretical physicist and Catholic priest, Monsignor Georges Lemaitre. He predicted the expanding universe. He predicted Hubble's constant, which is a big deal in astrophysics. He formulated what is mistakenly called Hubble's law years before Hubble did any of his work. This Belgian theoretical physicist worked it all out. And he predicted that if it's this now, if you calculate back, you get back to what he called the cosmic egg, which brings us neatly back to pigeons. The cosmic egg is what Big Bang theory later became. But Big Bang was a joke. Somebody proposed it as a title because it was just so absurd. But it turns out to have been the best standard model for cosmology. About the relationship between science and religion. When Stephen Hawking, now celebrated in the movie, wrote his famous book, A Brief History of Time, Lemaitre is not even mentioned in the index. Does that look like anti-Christian bias to you? It definitely is. So it's time to recommend a book on science and religion with a catchy title, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? Would you baptize an extraterrestrial? The two guys who wrote this, Guy Consolmagno and Paul Muller, are both Jesuits. Guy works for the Vatican Observatory out in Arizona. They have telescopes on the mountainside there. And he's an expert on asteroids and all that clutter that flies around inside the solar system. So Consolmagno has just won the Carl Sagan Prize for Astronomy. The irony of that is that Sagan was another one of these great public atheists. The guy who won his prize for outstanding work as a scientist is a Jesuit. The guy who invented Big Bang theory was a Monsignor in the Catholic Church. So it's a very entertaining book, very easy to read. We have a church library. I can't give you this one because it's going to be on loan for a student. So that's would you baptize an extraterrestrial? I know what you're thinking. You want to know whether they would or not. Well, if you play it. No. Only if she asks for it. I'll give you some feel for the book. Well, conflict. Does that look like conflict to you? It sure doesn't to me. And maybe science and religion should have nothing to do with each other. Some people think so. Famous biologists in Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould, thought that. Maybe they're completely separate. Maybe they don't need to talk to each other and just go their own separate ways, misunderstanding each other. But I don't think that's right. And I'm going to give an example from our field, a medical example. You know, there's been a huge scientific program to map the human genome. Very expensive, very successful. And geneticists have discovered that a defect in a single gene, connexin 26, I think it is, that's how it is, it causes about a third of all what's called non-syndromic deafness. That's where you're born deaf, and it's not the result of a disease or an accident or something. About a third of all deafness that you're born with comes about because of a single mistake, transcription error, in a single gene. And it's, there are clusters of people in the United States where this gene is very common. Of all things, Martha's Vineyard was a center for people who were deaf or very hard of hearing. And they, because it was an isolated little population, they kind of intensified the effects of this particular genetic problem. So there it is. People born deaf because of a genetic error. And along comes a new couple, they're nearly married, and they've come to get some genetic counseling, some screening, with a view to using in vitro fertilization to have a baby, test tube baby, in vitro fertilization. Now, the mother-to-be was born deaf, to deaf parents, so from birth she was taught American Sign Language. She's completely comfortable in that, very fluent. Her husband-to-be, or new husband, became deaf during the course of his childhood, never quite became comfortable with American Sign Language. Difficult for him to follow when he's at his wife's home and the family are speaking in American Sign Language quickly, he can't quite follow them all the time, and this is distressing. So on they come. They both attended Gallaudet University up in Washington, famous university for students who are either deaf or really quite hard of hearing. And what they want to do is use in vitro fertilization after screening, and then implant the fertilized egg in her, and she would carry the child and give birth. It's common, fairly effective, but quite expensive technique. So far, so good. But they don't think the way you do. They don't think of deafness as a handicap. They're proud of deaf culture with a capital D. They affirm deafness. And they want to use genetic screening to guarantee that any child they have is born deaf. Not trying to eliminate deafness. They insist that the child is born deaf, and they want to use medical science and genetics to guarantee that. And you can. So how would you react? You're a physician. If you were asked to do this, what would you do about that? How would you feel about that? I can tell you that in the medical schools they teach many wonderful things. Many of them are correct. And they also don't teach how to deal with complex social and ethical problems like this. We priests are taught to think about ethical and moral issues, especially complex ones. But this is difficult. I mean, think of it. We are constantly thinking that parents get the right to make choices for their children. You know, my parents, complete waste of time and money, had me take piano lessons. Just absolutely pointless. And yet, parents do get a right to make choices for their children. And no, the child doesn't usually get a vote. The choice is made by the parents. So what about this child? It's a child that's never going to hear bird song or the music of Bach. It's never going to hear the laughter of their own children. Is that a choice that you as a physician should be party to making? Because it's what the parents want. Yes, they're prepared to pay for it. And in a society also which values and works to values people's rights to be treated as people, and not just as specimens of some handicap or another, we try very hard to eliminate the disadvantages that people have. We do. We don't want to use the word handicap very much. We try to be a welcoming and generous society. Well, that's an example of how there could be a relationship, and in this case there really is, a relationship between science and religion, between genetics, between physicians who work in a fertilization lab, and in this case, an Anglican priest working with them to say, do you feel obliged to do this? what about your Hippocratic oath? Do no harm. But the parents say this isn't harm. It's very complex, very complicated. And I'm not going to tell you how the couple fared in their search to guarantee that they would only have a deaf child. But I will tell you that I took this example to a colleague of mine in England, who's rather a crusty old consultant physician, who's also a very devout Anglican. And I told him about it, and he said, nonsense. It's all nonsense and a complete waste of money and doctors' time. Tell the parents to go ahead and have their child in the normal way. The child is born hearing. They can always get a couple of pencils and shove them in their ears. Your doctors aren't like that. So, beware of British National Health Service. Except he's a very distinguished doctor. Now it's time to conclude. And I want to conclude by asking for your prayers, of course. And your prayers for the Society of Ordained Scientists. And 5 of us, who were all priests in the Church of England, and 2 of us are still alive, we all had advanced degrees in science. We're all university teachers. We met and we thought we would form a new dispersed order in the church because we felt that we had a vocation both as scientists in our various ways, Polkinghorne, Arthur Peacock, John Polkinghorne, Derek Stainsby, Eric Jenkins, and me. And we went around and we took advice from various Anglican communities. SSJE was very good, Benedictines were very good. We talked to the Jesuits, because there's a very strong European Jesuits and science community, so we took a lot of advice about how things could go. And in those days, the Archbishop of York, the Anglican Archbishop of York, was John Hepburn, who himself was a scientist, a research scientist from Cambridge. So we started the business of making ourselves into a society which would have a set of aims, and a rule, and a collect for life. I'm going to tell you what the aims of the society are, what the rule of the society is, and then I'm going to read the collect, and if you would, you could say amen at the end of it. Our aims are, first of all, to offer to God in our ordained role the work of science and technology in the exploration and stewardship of creation. The second is to express both the commitment of the Church to the scientific and technological world and our concern for its impact on the world, and to develop a fellowship of prayer for ordained scientists by the following of a common rule, and to support each other in our vocation, and to serve the Church in its relation to science and technology. This is our rule. We all pray each day for the aims of the society and for its members. We have a list of names, 120 of us now, there were 5 as well. And second, to remember the society and its members regularly in some form of public worship. And that's this. I have discharged my duty to my membership of the society, of which I was the second warden as well. I took this totally to heart. And third, to endeavour to attend our annual gathering and retreat. Here's our collect. Let us pray. Almighty God, Creator and Redeemer of all that is, source and foundation of time, space, matter and energy, life and consciousness, grant us in this society and all that study the mysteries of your creation, grace, to be true witnesses to your glory and faithful stewards of your gifts. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. I left my traditional 30 seconds for questions.
10 minutes?
I was told 10 seconds. So it's going to be a good question. Yeah. Yes. So do I. Yes. He's not a scientist, he just knows scientists and is very good at communicating. So we need him too, and others like him.
Well, it's funny because we selected very weird things about all of these scientists.
That's easy.
You remember?
I know them all. If I don't know them all, I certainly know a lot of them.
What was
Of
the
course,
name?
we're weird. Who would do this for a living?
Well, history of everything. Bill Bryson, he's a humorist.
Yes, Bill Bryson. wrote and has continued to write so wonderfully. He wrote a book about home, about our houses. Just terrific. You were going to ask the question.
Yes, when I was in Washington, a Episcopal priest addressed us during the religious service. And he said that he could tell us about many things that had happened since the Big Bang. I don't know if it was 13.7.
You were talking about Bill Fuller.
Well, maybe so. But anyway, he said, but I can tell you about many things like that, and so can all other scientists. But at the moment before the Big Bang, before the Big Bang, we had no knowledge.
There's a good reason for that, because in the Big Bang Theory, it's time and space that come into being simultaneously. And St. Augustine was asked a long time ago by somebody about what happened before the creation. And his answer was that God was preparing hell for people who ask stupid questions like that. So, hooray for the great saints of the church. Yeah, that's right. And it's worse than you think. The first period after the Big Bang is 0 point there. Nobody knows how time and space works. And one of my great friends, Chris Leishman at Imperial College in London, is the world's leading expert on quantum gravity. And he says, I wouldn't even know what the equations look like if someone put them in front of me. Because time is quantized, space is quantized, and gravity is quantized. And no one has any idea what that would mean. So it keeps us humble, and it gives us a job. We'd like to know. Yes?
I think one of the things that I would love the church to do is to bring a little bit more of that modern sense of space and cosmic history to our ritual. I know we have one Star Trek service, and I have a sense that keeps us outside of just little green involved.
We need somebody to do that. Right, the version C again. It's full of mistakes scientifically. And although it is our Star Trek thing, I never use it because I can't bring myself to utter scientific mistakes in a church. So get yourself a liturgist and write. I mean, if I had, another hour, which I don't.
Not on this visit, but
All right. Well, here it is for a future visit. Polkinghorne and Peacock and I wrote the creation story from the point of view of what we understood by modern science. The Genesis creation story, but instead of doing, the version that you get, we plugged it full of the, Peacock was a physical biochemist who worked in genetics. I'm a physicist working in medicine, Polkinghorne, a particle physicist. So we wrote this up, and it was the best fun. We spent a rainy afternoon inventing a new Genesis story, and using the science we knew. And if Wynne is ever rash enough to invite me back, or I could stand outside the street and just read it to you. You might want to hear it.
as long as you would think of rewriting prayer C in your retirement.
I hadn't really thought of engaging myself in tedium in retirement. A great friend of mine, a professor of English and an Anglican priest, served on the Church of England's liturgy committee, and said the reason that our prayers, in public prayer, is as bad as it is that there's no leading poet working among them.
Yes.
And if there were, some of those things that sound as though they're cloth ears, I mean, it just wouldn't be there. And you have to be able to read in such a way that you can read and have it enter the hearts of the people who are hearing it. And alas, that is not so. And today, at Christmas, I use, and there were in the same country, shepherds keeping watch. I still use the.
And so do we.
Good for you. Because the other one is rubbish. It was written by a really third-class advertising agency. It's just not worthy. And the original King James Version was written so that people could hear it. It was written, part of it, in a room in the college right next to mine in Oxford. So you could go there and see the very space. So yeah, good for you. Good too. Yeah.
That one and the Te Deum Laudamus, you are God, is an anathema.
The idea is that, look, as in looking at the stars at night, it's Christ. Jesus isn't fun. I think Jesus is so profound, so serious, so attractive, but not fun. And I don't think Toys R Us versions of Jesus really are what we should be about. There's a huge mystery here. There is in science, of course there is in Christianity, and I would say in Judaism and in Islam. And if you can sing with all your heart, let all mortal flesh keep silence. That's a good antidote to the lesson. I do have a lot of prejudices, don't I? But I've honed them over years. I was ordained in 1977, in the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee. It was Queen Elizabeth II. I'm mentor to four of the young clergy in this diocese. One of them was talking to me about, he was with another priest who administered the host, and this young priest was administering the chalice. One of the members of the congregation was an alcoholic, and he knew it. This man usually didn't receive the chalice. But this time, he reached out, and so my friend put the chalice in his hands, holding onto the lid there. And the man lifted it up and kissed at the side of the chalice, and gave it back, which I think is absolutely beautiful. If our liturgy helped us to feel the way that broken man did at that moment, then it would be a liturgy to offer to God. I'm totally, profoundly struck by the beauty of that act. And that's ostentation, not done for effect.
One of the major problems that non-believers would have is our miracles.
Yeah.
How does God work within the laws of nature without violating them?
Can't violate the laws of nature. The doctrine of creation is in two parts. There's creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. I see myself being signaled to taxi onto the ramp. But there's the other half of it, which is completely forgotten, is creatio continua, that God holds and sustains in being everything at all times. The miracle is what we see, the sustaining and being of every atom and molecule and thought and droplet of water, grain of sand and stars in the sky. That is God's sustaining creation. So when you talk about people talk about breaking the laws of nature, I'm absurd. It's a very bad doctrine of God that's at work there. Complete misunderstanding. 50% of the completely orthodox Christians believe in God. Continuously holding and being and sustaining and blessing. Why does God do that? Out of love and joy, and not out of malice. So I think David Hume fixed all that centuries ago, but who reads Hume? I've got to go. I'm told I should put a still on it. So should you.
You have. Thank you so much.